The shot was a splinter of sound that tore through the drowsy Kansas morning, followed instantly by the shattering of glass. For Sarah Holloway, the noise was a physical blow, snapping her from a reverie of grief. She stood before the teller's cage in the first bank of Prairie Dog Creek, her fingers clutching the one small thing of value she had left in the world, a silver locket smooth and cool against her palm. Chaos erupted. Men and women, moments before discussing crop prices and dry weather, screamed and dove for the floor. A second shot thundered, chewing a chunk of plaster from the ceiling that rained down like bitter snow. 3 men burst through the splintered doorway, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. 2 were brutes, all muscle and crude motion, wielding shotguns with a terrifying lack of care. The third, their leader, moved with a different kind of energy, a cold, fluid precision. He was tall and lean in a black duster, and the pistol in his hand seemed an extension of his will. "On the floor, all of you." One of the brutes roared, his voice a gravelly command. Now. Sarah, paralyzed by a fresh wave of shock in a year that had been nothing but found her legs wouldn't obey. She remained standing, a solitary calico-clad figure in a sea of prostrate bodies. The leader's eyes, chips of obsidian above his bandana, found hers. He glided toward her, his boots making no sound on the marble floor. The scent of gun smoke and dry dust followed him. "The lady appears to be hard of hearing," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm baritone. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the fine stitching on his leather gloves. His gaze dropped to her clenched fist. "What are you holding so tightly?" Her throat was a desert. It's nothing," she managed the words, a dry rasp. "Just a trinket." She had walked for 3 days after burying her husband Thomas, and then a week later their stillborn child in a shallow, unmarked grave. This locket, with its tiny hand-painted portrait of a younger, smiling Thomas, was the last tangible piece of that life. She had come to the bank not to deposit, but to sell. She needed money for a train ticket, for a meal, for any destination that was not the crushing emptiness of the prairie. The man extended a gloved hand. "I'll be the judge of that." When she hesitated, his fingers snapped around her wrist with the speed of a striking snake. His grip was not brutal, but immensely strong, an iron band that made the bones in her arm ache. With his other hand, he calmly pried her fingers open one by one, revealing the tarnished silver disc. "A locket," he mused, his voice devoid of any real interest. He flicked it open with his thumb. For a heartbreaking second, Thomas's smiling face looked up at the cold-eyed stranger. The leader studied it for a moment, his head cocked. Then with a click, he snapped it shut. Hardly worth the effort. "Please," Sarah whispered the word, a ragged plea. The humiliation was a hot brand on her cheeks, but she didn't care. "It has no value. It's all I have left of him." The man looked from the locket back to her face, a flicker of something not pity, but a kind of cruel contemplation in his eyes. He didn't seem to be stealing an object. He seemed to be collecting a piece of her despair. He let go of her wrist and dropped the locket into his duster pocket as if it were a spent shell casing. "Now you have nothing," he said simply. He turned away without a backward glance. Silas, one of his men, barked from the teller's cage where they were stuffing cash into canvas sacks. "We're full up." "Then we're done," the leader, Silas, replied. He surveyed the terrorized people on the floor with an air of profound disinterest. 5 minutes. Anyone so much as looks out a window before then, and we'll come back to burn this town to the ground. He and his men backed out of the bank, melting into the dust and chaos of the street. The sound of galloping horses faded into the distance. For a long minute, the only sound in the bank was the ragged collective breathing of its occupants, and the soft, almost silent sobs that escaped Sarah's lips. She had lost her husband, her child, her home, and her future. Now a cold-eyed man named Silas Blackwood had stolen her past too. The emptiness inside her was no longer a hollow ache. It was a shard of ice. And on it was etched a single burning purpose. She would find that man, and she would get her locket back. The sun hammered the cracked earth into a pale, shimmering anvil. For a week, Sarah walked west, following the iron rails that promised a way forward, even if she had no destination. The Kansas territory bled into a landscape of rock and thorn, where the wind whispered through skeletal saguaros like forgotten ghosts. The money she'd had in her pocket, a few meager dollars, was gone, spent on stale bread and tins of water in dusty outposts that were little more than names on a map. Her shoes, once sturdy, were disintegrating. The grief that had been her fuel was slowly being baked out of her, leaving behind a brittle, desperate resolve. She walked until her vision blurred and the horizon swam in a heat haze. The name of the next town, learned from a passing freight driver, had become a mantra: Redemption Gulch. It sounded like a promise or a prayer. She wasn't looking for salvation, only a place to stop to think, to find a way to track a man who had vanished like a phantom. As the distant shapes of buildings finally solidified through the shimmering air, her strength gave out. Each step was a monumental effort. She reached the town's small wooden depot, the whistle of an approaching locomotive, a shrill cry in the oppressive silence. Travelers on the platform blurred into indistinct shapes. She stumbled up the steps, her hand reaching for the depot wall to steady herself, but her fingers found only air. Darkness swarmed at the edges of her vision, and the splintered wooden planks rose up to meet her. Through a haze of semi-consciousness, she heard murmurs, the scuff of boots, but no one came closer. Then a deep voice cut through the fog. "Stand back, folks. Give her some air." A pair of worn leather boots appeared in her line of sight, followed by the shadow of a man kneeling beside her. She flinched as he reached for her, a lifetime of caution, screaming a silent warning. "Easy now, ma'am. You're safe." His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but the hand that gently supported her was strong and steady. He lifted her to a sitting position, and when he removed his hat, she found herself looking into eyes the color of a stormy sky, a deep, troubled blue. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered lines framed by dark, unruly hair. He looked like a man who had wrestled with the land, and more often than not won. "Name's Jack Callahan," he said, his voice a low rumble. He offered a canteen. "Looks like you've come a long way." Sarah's lips were cracked and dry. "I have nothing," she whispered, the words rasping in her throat. Her empty hands lay uselessly in her lap. Jack Callahan's gaze was direct, unwavering. It was a look that seemed to see right through her dirt-streaked skin to the bone-deep weariness beneath. "That's not a problem I can't solve," he said, his tone clipped and matter-of-fact. He made no move to touch her again, but there was an unexpected protectiveness in his stance. He stood his large frame a sudden shield against the curious stares of the onlookers. "Doc Miller's office is just across the street. I'll take you there." He wasn't asking permission. Before she could protest, he scooped her up as if she weighed no more than a child. The motion was surprisingly gentle. Her head rested against the solid wall of his chest, the scent of leather sweat and clean earth filling her senses. As he strode across the dusty street, his steps were long and sure. Why, she managed to whisper the question aimed at his chambray shirt. He didn't look down. "Because I've been where you are," he said, his voice flat. "And no one was there to pick me up." The doctor, a kind-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose, diagnosed dehydration, exhaustion, and the beginnings of a fever. He worked efficiently, his hands gentle but professional. Jack waited outside, a silent, brooding presence on the porch. Later, after she'd been given water and a bitter tonic, Doc Miller left them alone. Jack stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "The doctor says you need to rest for a few days," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I've settled your bill." "You don't even know me." Sarah said, her voice a little stronger now. "Why would you do that?" "You needed help." He finally looked at her, and the troubled blue of his eyes seemed to darken. "Consider it a debt, paid to a ghost." The cryptic answer hung in the air, unexplained. He was about to leave when she spoke again, a new urgency in her voice. "The men who did this, the ones who robbed the bank back in Prairie Dog Creek, I need to find their leader." Jack paused, his hand on the doorframe. "That's sheriff's business, ma'am." "The sheriff won't care about what he took from me," she insisted, pushing herself up on her elbows. "He took a silver locket. It was my husband's." She described the man, Silas, his cold precision, his chillingly calm voice, the black duster he wore. As she spoke, a change came over Jack Callahan. He went utterly still, his knuckles whitening where he gripped his hat. The distant, gruff demeanor vanished, replaced by a coiled tension that filled the small room. "This man," Jack said, his voice dangerously low. "Describe him again." She did, adding the detail of his obsidian eyes and the way he moved like a predator. Jack's face was a mask of stone, but a muscle worked in his jaw. He knew the name, or the man, or both. The air crackled with a history she couldn't comprehend. Silas Blackwood. Jack said the name, not a question, but a confirmation, spoken like a curse. "You know him?" Jack's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw past the gruff exterior to the haunted man beneath. She saw a pain so deep it was part of his bones. His decision was made in that instant, a choice forged in a past he clearly could not escape. "I'll help you," he said, and the words sounded like a death sentence. "But you need to understand something. You're not just chasing a thief. You're walking into a war that started a long time ago. And Blackwood, he doesn't just want to win. He wants to burn everything to the ground." Jack's offer of help came with rigid conditions. He would take her to his ranch 3 miles out of town where she could recover her strength. His housekeeper, a widow named Agnes, would be there. Sarah's reputation would be protected. But their arrangement was temporary and strictly business. He was helping her for his own reasons, and he made it clear he wasn't looking for complications. The ride to the ranch was a silent, tense affair. Jack handled the wagon with an economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning the rock-strewn landscape. Sarah, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, studied his profile. He was a man locked away inside himself, the key long since lost. The ranch was nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, a collection of modest but well-kept buildings that spoke of years of hard, solitary work. A sturdy, gray-haired woman emerged from the house as they pulled up, wiping her hands on an apron. Her eyes were as sharp and shrewd as a hawk's. "So this is the trouble you found at the depot," she said, her gaze sweeping over Sarah in a thorough, no-nonsense assessment. This was Agnes. "She needs a place to stay for a while," Jack said, his tone brooking no argument. "She'll be helping you out in the house once she's stronger." "Humph." Another mouth to feed, Agnes grumbled, but there was no real heat in it. She turned to Sarah. "Well, don't just sit there. Come on in. Supper won't cook itself." Her speech was as clipped as Jack's, but laced with a dry, sardonic wit. The first few days were a trial. Agnes was a formidable presence, her protectiveness of Jack a fortress around the house. She watched Sarah's every move, her silence more intimidating than any question. The first obstacle Sarah realized was not tracking Silas Blackwood, but surviving Agnes. "He's a good man, you know," Agnes said one afternoon, startling Sarah as they peeled potatoes in the kitchen. "Took me in after my husband passed. Gave me a home when I had nothing. He doesn't let many people in." The unspoken message was clear: don't you dare hurt him. "I have no intention of causing him any trouble," Sarah replied quietly. "I just want to get my locket back. After that, I'll be on my way." Agnes snorted. "Nothing's ever that simple with him. He's got ghosts that follow him everywhere he goes. Looks to me like you brought another one right to his doorstep." To earn their trust, Sarah worked. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, and learned Agnes's precise kitchen routines without complaint. She was quiet, observant, and she never asked Jack about his connection to Blackwood. She waited, letting her quiet competence speak for her. Slowly, the fortress walls began to lower. Agnes started leaving her with more responsibility. Jack began to linger at the supper table, occasionally drawn into conversation. They learned she was a widow, that she'd lost a child, but she offered no other details of her past, and they did not press. After a week, Jack deemed her strong enough to begin their investigation. "We'll start in town," he said one evening. "Ask questions. But we have to be discreet. If Blackwood has friends in Redemption Gulch, we don't want them knowing what we're up to." Their first stop was the saloon, a noisy, smoke-filled establishment run by a man with a handlebar mustache and wary eyes. While Jack ordered drinks, Sarah scanned the room. Redemption Gulch was a hard town filled with miners and cowboys, whose faces were maps of tough lives. Seeing a man, Jack began leaning casually against the bar, tall, dresses in black. Moves quiet. Goes by the name Silas Blackwood. The saloon owner polished a glass, his eyes flicking up to Jack's. "Might have. Fella like that passed through a few weeks back. Didn't stay long. But he was asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. The owner shrugged. "Asking about old-timers. Specifically anyone who used to wear a U.S. Marshal's badge. Seemed mighty interested in a lawman who used to work the territory a few years back." He squinted at Jack. "Funny thing is, you fit the description he gave of the man he was looking for." A chill went down Sarah's spine. Blackwood wasn't just passing through. He had been looking for Jack. Over the next few days, they pieced together more clues. A grizzled old prospector remembered Blackwood asking about a shootout that had happened 5 years prior near the old silver mine. The blacksmith recalled repairing a horseshoe for one of Blackwood's men just last week. The horse, he noted, had come from the direction of the abandoned Miller cabin, a derelict shack a few miles north of town. Each new piece of information tightened the knot of dread in Sarah's stomach. This was more than a chance encounter. This was a hunt, and Jack was the prey. The shared danger forged a bond between them. On the long rides to and from town, they began to talk. She told him about her husband Thomas and the farm. He spoke of the ranch, of the simple satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He remained guarded about his past, but she could feel him slowly, cautiously letting her in. One evening, their quiet work was shattered. As they rode back to the ranch, 2 riders appeared on a ridge silhouetted against the setting sun. They were lean, hard-faced men, and they carried rifles with an unsettling familiarity. "Blackwood's men," Jack said, his voice grim. He pulled his horse to a halt. "Don't show fear." The riders trotted down to meet them, blocking the trail. Callahan, the lead rider, set a smirk on his face. "Silas sends his regards. He wants you to know he's getting close." "Tell him I'm not hard to find," Jack replied, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. The man's eyes flicked to Sarah. "And he's very interested in your new companion. He has something that belongs to her. he'd be happy to return it in exchange for a conversation with you. The threat was unmistakable. They were using her, using the locket as bait. The conversation can happen any time, Jack said, his voice like stone. Now get off my land. The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Soon, Callahan. Real soon. They wheeled their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the twilight. Sarah was trembling, a cold fury mixing with her fear. He knows I'm with you. He planned it, Jack said, his face a grim mask. The robbery, taking your locket? It was all a message. For me. He spurred his horse, and they rode for the ranch at a hard pace. The pretense of a simple investigation was over. The war had come to them. That night, a new tension settled over the ranch house. Jack cleaned his rifle with methodical, deliberate movements, his face set in stone. Agnes moved about the kitchen, her lips a thin, worried line. The unspoken truth was that Sarah had not just brought a ghost to Jack's door. She had led the devil himself. Their shared purpose now had teeth. They were no longer just seeking an object. They were preparing for a siege. And in the quiet moments between watching the horizon and planning their next move, Sarah found herself looking at Jack Callahan not as a reluctant savior, but as a partner. Their hands would brush as they passed in the narrow hallway. Their eyes would meet across the dinner table. And in those fleeting seconds, an understanding passed between them. A connection forged not in whispered sweetness, but in the crucible of shared adversity. The attack came 3 nights later under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. It wasn't a direct assault, but something more insidious. A fire deliberately set in the hayloft of the barn. Jack was awake instantly, the smell of smoke cutting through the still night air. "Stay in the house," he yelled to Sarah and Agnes as he grabbed his rifle and ran out the door. "Keep the doors locked." From the kitchen window, Sarah watched in horror as flames clawed at the barn roof, painting the night sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The terrified screams of the horses trapped inside were a sound that would haunt her forever. Jack, a solitary figure against the inferno, worked frantically to unlatch the corral gate, freeing the cattle before turning his attention to the burning barn. Then the shots came, pings of lead biting into the log walls of the house. They weren't trying to hit anyone. They were pinning them down, preventing them from helping Jack, forcing him to choose between his livestock and his own safety. "Get down," Agnes hissed, pulling Sarah away from the window and handing her an old shotgun. "He told me to give you this if there was ever trouble. You know how to use it." "My husband taught me," Sarah said, her hands surprisingly steady as she checked the weapon. The fire was a distraction, a cruel piece of theater. The real threat was out there in the darkness. Jack had managed to wrench open one of the large barn doors, and a horse galloped out, its mane alight with sparks, before Jack was driven back by the heat and a fresh volley of shots. He took cover behind a water trough, returning fire into the shadows. It was a stalemate. The barn was being consumed, and Jack was trapped. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. She would not stand by and watch this man who had saved her be destroyed. "Agnes, cover the front window," she said, a desperate plan forming in her mind. "When I give the signal, make as much noise as you can." Before Agnes could protest, Sarah slipped out the back door, using the deep shadows of the house as cover. She moved silently, the shotgun held tight against her chest, circling around toward the cottonwood grove that bordered the corral. The shooters were focused on the front of the house and Jack's position. They wouldn't expect an attack from the flank. She found them behind a rocky outcrop, 2 of them the same 2 who had confronted them on the trail. They were reloading, laughing, as they watched the barn burn. "Should have just shot him," one grumbled. "Nah, Silas wants him alive," the other replied. "Wants him to watch everything he loves turn to ash first. That's the point." Rage, cold and pure, washed over Sarah. She raised the shotgun, the weight of it, familiar and terrible. "Now, Agnes," she screamed into the night. From the house, a window shattered as Agnes fired a shot into the air, yelling at the top of her lungs. The two men, startled, spun around. In that split second of confusion, Sarah fired. The shotgun blast was a deafening roar, its kick slamming her back against a tree. One of the men screamed and collapsed, clutching his leg. The other panicked, fired a wild shot in her direction that splintered the bark above her head before scrambling away into the darkness. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise. Jack used the opportunity to charge from behind the trough, his rifle at the ready. But the second man was already gone. He ran to the man Sarah had shot, kicked the pistol from his hand, and then looked toward the trees, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Sarah," he called out, his voice raw. She stepped out of the shadows, the heavy shotgun dangling from her hand. Her whole body was trembling. The barn was a roaring funeral pyre now beyond saving. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt hay. Jack stared at her, then at the groaning man on the ground, and finally at the still smoldering barn. The fight was over, but the cost was devastating. As he walked toward her, he stumbled, catching himself against a fence post. It was only then, in the flickering firelight, that she saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt sleeve and the blood dripping from his fingers. "You're hurt," she whispered, rushing to his side. "It's just a graze," he said, his voice strained as he clutched his arm. But his face was pale, his eyes filled with a terrible, bleak emptiness. The fire had taken more than just a building. It had burned away the last of his defenses. Agnes came running from the house, her face streaked with soot. Together, they helped him inside, leaving the wounded gunman tied up and groaning by the fence. In the warm light of the kitchen, the wound was worse than a graze. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm. As Agnes fetched bandages and whiskey to clean the wound, Jack sat heavily at the table, his rifle leaning against the wall. He stared at his own bloody hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "He wanted me to watch it burn," he said, his voice hollow. "He knew it would remind me." Sarah, tearing strips of clean linen, paused. "Remind you of what, Jack?" He looked up at her, his haunted eyes finally letting her see all the way in. The pain, the guilt, and the ghosts Agnes had spoken of, they were all there, raw and exposed. He took a long, shuddering breath. 5 years ago, he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't a rancher. I was a U.S. Marshal. We were tracking a gang of outlaws, violent men. We cornered them in a mining town north of here. A shootout started in the middle of the street." He looked away, his gaze fixed on a dark corner of the room. It was chaos, bullets flying everywhere. "I saw one of them take aim at my partner. I fired. I was a good shot. I never missed." His voice broke. "But a boy? A young man, really?" "He ran out of the general store right into my line of fire. He wasn't more than 17. Sarah stopped breathing. She could feel where the story was going, a sense of tragic, horrifying inevitability. "He died right there in the street." Jack continued, the words torn from him. "An innocent bystander. I was cleared. The inquiry called it a tragic accident. But it didn't matter." He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for an understanding he didn't feel he deserved. "The boy's name was Ethan Blackwood." The name landed in the silent kitchen with the force of a physical blow. Silas Blackwood's younger brother. Silas was there. Jack said, his voice now flat and dead. He was older already, on the wrong side of the law himself, but he doted on that kid. I saw his face that day, the look in his eyes. It wasn't just grief. It was a promise. Suddenly, everything made a sickening kind of sense. The hunt for a former marshal, the questions in town, the cruelty of taking Sarah's locket, a memento of a lost loved one. Silas wasn't a common thief driven by greed. He was an artist of vengeance. He's not after money, Sarah whispered, the pieces clicking into place. He's after you. He doesn't just want to kill me, Jack said, a terrible clarity dawning on his face. That would be too easy. He wants to take everything from me first. My ranch, my peace, you. He orchestrated this. He put you in that bank, Sarah. He knew taking your locket would send you looking for it. He led you here. He used your grief to get to my guilt. The revelation was staggering. She hadn't been a victim of random circumstance. She had been a pawn in a twisted 5-year-old vendetta. The conflict was no longer about a stolen piece of silver. It was a complex tragedy of 2 men destroyed by one stray bullet, a story of grief twisted into a monstrous, calculating hatred. And she was standing right in the middle of it. After the confession, a grim resolve settled over the kitchen. Agnes, her face a mask of sorrow for the man she considered a son, finished bandaging Jack's arm with fierce, protective hands. The wounded gunman outside was a problem, but a smaller one than the architect of their misery. We have to go to the sheriff, Sarah said, her voice firm. This isn't just a grudge anymore. It's attempted murder, arson. We have a witness. She gestured with her head toward the man tied up outside. Jack looked weary, the fight and the confession having drained him. Sheriff Brody is a good man, he said, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He's always been fair with me. Then he's our only choice, Agnes stated, packing a small bag with fresh bandages and a flask of water. We can't fight Silas and his whole gang alone. They made the decision to ride for town at first light. Jack locked their prisoner in the storm cellar, a small, secure space beneath the pantry. Before they left, Jack paused at the door, turning to Sarah. His eyes were clear, the haunted look replaced by a quiet determination. I'm sorry I dragged you into this, he said. You didn't, she countered, meeting his gaze. Silas did. He used me, Jack. He took the last memory I had of my husband to hurt you. This is my fight too now. The ride into Redemption Gulch was tense. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the land, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When they reached the town, it was just beginning to stir. They went straight to the sheriff's office, a small clapboard building next to the assay office. Sheriff Brody was a portly man in his 50s, with a kind face and a calm, reassuring demeanor. He was the pillar of the community. Jack had described a man who settled disputes and kept the peace with a quiet authority. He listened patiently as Jack laid out the entire story, the fire, the attack, the confession of Silas Blackwood's motive, and the prisoner locked in his cellar. That's a heavy tale, Jack, the sheriff said, steepling his fingers on his desk. He looked at Sarah with sympathy. And you, ma'am, to be caught in the middle of it. Despicable. We need you to ride out to the ranch and take custody of the prisoner, Jack urged. He can testify against Blackwood. Of course, Brody said, nodding. But first things first. I need to take your official statements. It'll take a little while to write it all down. Why don't you have a seat? He gestured to 2 chairs in front of his desk. I'll get some coffee brewing. As the sheriff bustled about, a sense of relief began to creep over Sarah. They had done the right thing. The law would handle it now. Jack, however, still seemed on edge, his gaze fixed on the rifle rack on the wall behind Brody's desk. You know, it's a funny coincidence, Sheriff Brody said conversationally as he measured out coffee grounds. That Blackwood name sounds familiar. Years ago, before I got this post, I used to ride with a posse now and then. worked for a wealthy rancher outside of Wichita, a man named Cyrus Blackwood. Jack went very still. Silas's father. That's the one the sheriff set his back still to them. Fine man. Paid well. He was heartbroken when his youngest boy, Ethan, was killed in that mess you got into. The whole family was. Old Cyrus always felt the law let his boy down. The sheriff turned around a pot of coffee in his hand, but his expression was no longer kind or reassuring. It was cold, flat, and filled with a weary sort of pity. In his other hand, he now held a Colt Peacemaker, and it was aimed squarely at Jack's chest. He asked me to keep an eye out for you if you ever surfaced, Brody said, his voice dropping to a low, regretful tone. Told me if his boy Silas ever came looking for justice, I was to help him get it. I owe that family. The betrayal was so sudden, so absolute, it stole the air from Sarah's lungs. The benevolent sheriff, the pillar of the community, was on Silas's payroll. He had been helping him all along. Brody, don't do this, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. He hadn't moved, but his entire body was coiled like a spring. My hands are tied, Jack. Silas is on his way now. He wanted to make sure you had nowhere left to run, no law to turn to. He wanted you to feel completely and utterly alone. The sheriff gestured with the pistol. Now stand up. Slowly. You too, ma'am. You're going into the holding cell. Silas wants to have his final conversation with you, somewhere a little more dramatic. As the iron door of the cell clanged shut behind them, the sheriff's words echoed in the small, dark space. Their last hope had been a lie. They were trapped, disarmed, and their enemy was coming for them. The trap wasn't just set, it had been sprung. The cell was a cage of despair. A single high window barred with thick iron offered only a sliver of mocking blue sky. Rain began to fall, a slow, mournful drumming on the tin roof that mirrored the frantic beating of Sarah's heart. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that promised a storm. He played us, Jack said, his voice raw with fury. He paced the small space his wounded arm held stiffly at his side. I walked us right into it. I trusted him. You couldn't have known, Sarah said, trying to keep her own panic at bay. He had the whole town fooled. She ran her hands over the cold iron bars of the door, testing them. They were immovable. We have to get out of here. Brody took my gun belt, Jack said, stopping his pacing to stare at the lock. There's no way to pick it. As the storm outside gathered strength, rain lashing against the building, Sarah's mind raced. She thought back to the sheriff's office, trying to remember every detail. The cluttered desk, the rifle rack, the pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a ring of keys hanging on a hook by the door. Keys! They were so close, yet impossibly far. She peered through the bars into the empty office. Brody was gone, likely gone to meet Blackwood. But he wouldn't have left the main office door unlocked. He was corrupt, not stupid. The evidence, she whispered, thinking aloud. When we were talking to the sheriff, I saw him put my things, my satchel, into a drawer in his desk. He called it evidence. What's in it? Jack asked, moving to stand beside her. Nothing of value? A hairbrush, some thread, and my sewing needles. Jack's eyes lit with a flicker of hope. He looked from her to the desk, then back to the lock on their cell. It's a long shot. It's the only shot we have, she replied. The problem was distance. The desk was a good 10 feet from the cell door, but Jack's belt, the one Brody had taken, lay coiled on the floor near the desk. An idea, desperate and fragile, began to form. My dress, Sarah said, turning her back to him. There's a long sash at the waist. Undo it. Understanding dawned on Jack's face. He quickly untied the fabric sash. It was nearly 5 feet long. Not enough. Sarah then pointed to her petticoat. There's a drawstring. It's strong. Together they worked, their fingers fumbling in the dim light. They tied the sash and the drawstring together, creating a makeshift rope. Now for the hook. Sarah pulled a long pin from her hair, a simple piece of steel she used to keep her bun in place. It was sturdy. She bent it painstakingly against the stone floor, shaping it into a crude hook. They tied the hairpin to the end of their fabric rope. It was a flimsy tool for a desperate gamble. With painstaking care, Jack cast the line through the bars, aiming for the belt on the floor. The hairpin hook was too light. It skittered across the wooden planks, failing to catch. Rain hammered down the thunder, now a series of deafening cracks directly overhead. Time was running out. "We need more weight," Sarah muttered. She looked down at her own hands, at the simple gold wedding band from her marriage to Thomas. It was a circle of painful memories, a symbol of a life that was over. Without a second thought, she twisted it from her finger. "Here." Jack looked at the ring and then at her face, understanding the sacrifice. He said nothing, just took the ring and worked it onto the hairpin, securing it tightly. The added weight made the difference. On the third cast, the hook snagged the leather of the belt. Inch by agonizing inch, Jack pulled it toward them, the buckle scraping softly against the floor. When it was finally within reach, he used the stiff end of the belt to snag the ring of keys from the hook by the door. The clatter as they hit the floor sounded as loud as a gunshot. Another 10 minutes of tense, frustrating work with the belt, and they finally managed to drag the keys into the cell. The third key fit the lock. The door swung open with a groan of protest. They were free, but far from safe. Jack retrieved his pistol from the holster, its familiar weight a small comfort. In the desk drawer, Sarah found her satchel, and to her surprise, her silver locket, which Brody had apparently taken from their prisoner. Silas must have given it to his man as a trophy. She clutched it in her hand, and the cool metal a spark of courage. As she put it in her pocket, her fingers brushed against a stack of papers in the same drawer. A ledger. She pulled it out. It was a record of payments, names, and dates. And there, repeated over and over, were the names Cyrus Blackwood and Silas Blackwood, next to sums of money paid to Sheriff Brody. Proof. She tucked the ledger into her satchel. "He's not going to expect us to come after him." Jack said, his voice a low growl. "He'll think we're running." "Where would he take us for that dramatic conversation?" Sarah asked. "The saloon," Jack said without hesitation. "It'll be empty because of the storm. It's in the center of town, neutral ground. That's Silas's style. He likes an audience, even if it's just the ghosts in the room." They slipped out into the raging storm. The street was a river of mud, the rain coming down in blinding sheets. The saloon was just as Jack predicted, dark, save for a single lantern left burning on the bar, its light casting long dancing shadows. They crept in through the back water streaming from their clothes. Silas Blackwood was there, standing by the large front window, staring out at the storm. Sheriff Brody stood nervously by the bar. Silas turned as they entered, a slow, deliberate movement. He wasn't surprised. He was pleased. "Excellent," he said, a thin smile touching his lips. "I was hoping you'd be foolish enough to save me the trouble of a hunt. I do so hate hunting cornered animals. There's no sport in it." "It's over," Blackwood Jack said, his pistol steady in his hand, aimed at Silas. Sarah moved to the side, positioning herself behind a heavy wooden table, the shotgun from the sheriff's office now in her hands. Over Silas laughed a dry, mirthless sound. "My dear Marshal, it has barely begun." He ignored Jack's pistol and took a step forward, his eyes locking on Jack's face. Do you know what it's like to see your 17-year-old brother, the only good thing in a miserable world, bleed out in the dirt because of a lawman's mistake? He wasn't a criminal, Callahan. He was a good boy. He wanted to be a doctor. He would have saved lives. But you took his. A life for a life seems fair, does it not? His death was an accident, Jack said, his voice strained. A tragic one that I have to live with every single day. And now you will die with it. Silas replied, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. He was waging a psychological war, trying to break Jack with guilt before a single shot was fired. But not before you understand my pain. That's why she is here. He nodded toward Sarah. I saw her in that bank, clutching that little trinket of her dead husband. I saw the same loss in her eyes that was in my father's, in my own. So I took it. I wanted you to see that loss up close. I wanted you to feel responsible for her pain, just as you were responsible for mine. I wanted to destroy the man you are now before I killed the man you once were. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow in the tense silence. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating Silas's face, a mask of pure, distilled hatred. You're a coward, Blackwood. Sarah said, her voice ringing out in the charged atmosphere. You hide behind your grief and call it justice. Silas's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. You would have been wise to remain silent, Mrs. Holloway. But since you've spoken, allow me to make you part of the final act. He drew his own pistol with lightning speed. Drop your gun, Callahan, or the lady's reunion with her husband will be much sooner than she planned. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his weapon. It was a standoff. Sheriff Brody, sweating profusely, raised his own pistol, aiming it shakily at Jack. It was in that moment that Sarah saw it. On a small table next to Silas sat a bottle of whiskey and a single glass. He had been toasting his victory, and next to the bottle lay her locket, which he had presumably taken back from Brody. He had placed it there deliberately, a prop in his grim play, a symbol of the loss he wielded as a weapon. His obsession was his weakness. He deserved to die, you know. Sarah said suddenly, her voice conversational, almost casual. Silas frowned, distracted. Who did? My husband, she said, her voice cold and clear. Thomas. He was a cruel man. I was glad when he was gone. As she spoke, she took one step back, her hand moving subtly toward the stack of poker chips on the table beside her. The lie was a calculated risk, an attempt to shatter Silas's twisted narrative. He had built his entire revenge on the idea of shared noble grief. Her words twisted it into something ugly and cheap. You're lying, Silas hissed, momentarily thrown off balance. Am I? Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. That locket doesn't hold a treasured memory. It holds the face of my tormentor. It was the opening she needed. While Silas's focus was shattered, his righteous fury momentarily confused, she swept the entire stack of heavy clay poker chips off the table. They crashed onto the floor with a loud, startling clatter, scattering across the wooden planks like stones. The diversion worked. For a split second, every eye, including Silas's, darted toward the sound. In that instant, Jack moved. He didn't shoot to kill. He fired once the shot echoing the thunder outside. The bullet struck Silas's hand, sending his pistol flying across the room. Silas screamed in pain and rage. At the same time, Jack lunged forward, tackling the stunned Sheriff Brody and sending him crashing into the bar. The climax was over. Jack stood over a disarmed, wounded Silas Blackwood, his pistol aimed at the man's heart. Rain lashed against the windows, and the clock ticked on. The moral stake was laid bare. Would Jack pull the trigger, becoming the killer Silas believed him to be? and repeat the mistake that had ruined his life, or had he truly found redemption? He held the position for a long second, then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his gun. He was not that man anymore. In the aftermath of the storm, a fragile quiet descended upon Redemption Gulch. With Silas Blackwood wounded and Sheriff Brody locked in his own cell, the fight was over. Sarah used the telegraph office to wire the U.S. Marshal's Service in the next territory, detailing the events and referencing the ledgers she had found, which now sat in the hands of the stunned town council. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. Silas, his face pale and his arm crudely bandaged, was taken into federal custody the next day. As they led him away in chains, his eyes found Jack. They were no longer filled with hatred, only a vast, hollow emptiness. His quest for revenge had failed, leaving him with nothing but the grief he had tried so desperately to weaponize. The exposure of Brody's corruption sent shockwaves through the town. But the community, practical and resilient, quickly appointed a temporary deputy and began the process of rebuilding their trust in the law. For Jack and Sarah, the consequences were more personal. They returned to the ranch to find the charred skeleton of the barn standing like a monument to their ordeal. Agnes, her relief palpable, had already begun the monumental task of cleaning up. But the physical damage was secondary to the emotional toll. Jack was quiet, withdrawn, the specter of his past once again looming over him. He had survived, that he had made the right choice in the saloon, but the guilt remained. One evening, a few days later, Sarah found him standing by the corral fence, staring at the ruins of the barn. She came to stand beside him, her presence a quiet offering of comfort. In her hand, she held the silver locket. "I got it back," she said softly. He glanced at it, then back at her. Was it worth it? She thought for a moment. The locket isn't what I was fighting for. Not really. I was fighting for the idea that men like Silas Blackwood don't get to decide what we have left. He tried to turn my past into a weapon against you. But it's just a memory. My future, that's more important. She slipped the locket into her apron pocket. It no longer felt like the only thing she owned. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Your actions in that saloon were a kind of redemption, Jack. You faced the man who hated you most in the world, and you chose mercy. You proved you are not the man he tried to make you." "It doesn't change what happened to his brother," he said, his voice heavy. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself for it." The next morning, Jack made a decision. He hitched the wagon not for a trip to town, but for a longer journey north toward the old mining town where his past was buried. He didn't ask Sarah to come, but she was waiting by the wagon when he finished, her small satchel in hand. They didn't speak much on the way. The landscape was scarred and beautiful, and the silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. The town was little more than a ghost of what it had been, with a few ramshackle buildings leaning against the wind. The cemetery was on a small, windswept hill overlooking the valley. They found the grave easily. The headstone was simple, weathered by 5 years of harsh seasons. Ethan Blackwood, beloved son and brother, age 17. Jack stood before it for a long time, his hat in his hands. The wind whipped his hair around his face, but he didn't seem to notice. Sarah gave him his space, watching from a respectful distance. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pocket watch, its chain glistening in the sunlight. "This was my father's," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the wind. "He gave it to me when I pinned on my badge. He told me to remember that time is the one thing you can never get back." He opened the cover, looked at the face for a moment, then snapped it shut. My time stopped right here 5 years ago. You're 5. He knelt and gently placed the watch on the earth at the base of the headstone. It was not an apology, words were inadequate for that, but an offering. A symbol of the guilt in the frozen years he was finally letting go. The act didn't erase his past, but it was an acceptance, a quiet promise to himself to start living forward again. As he stood up, his shoulders seemed lighter. He took Sarah's hand, and they turned to leave. That's when Sarah saw it. Tucked into a small crevice in the headstone, protected from the worst of the weather, was a small oilskin-wrapped package. Curious, she gently retrieved it. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed and the ink faded but still legible. Jack took it from her, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The letter was dated nearly 5 years ago, not long after the burial. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It began, "To the lawman who carries the burden of my son's death." Jack's breath hitched. He read the letter aloud, his voice thick with emotion. It was from Ethan's mother. She wrote not of anger or vengeance, but of a mother's profound, soul-deep grief. She wrote of Ethan's goodness, of his dreams. But then the letter took an unexpected turn. "I know my older son, Silas, is consumed by a hatred that will destroy him," she had written. "And I know my husband's pride will seek a worldly justice that brings no peace. But I am a mother who has lost a child, and I know that you are a man who will carry that loss forever. I do not know the circumstances of that day, only that my gentle boy is gone. But I cannot bear the thought of his memory being used to create more pain, more death. Vengeance will not bring him back. Therefore I offer you what my husband and son cannot, my forgiveness. I pray you find peace. I pray you do not let this tragedy define the rest of your days. Go and live a good life. It is the only justice that matters now." A tear tracked its way through the dust on Jack's cheek. This final surprise at this act of grace from a woman he had never met was the one thing he never knew he needed. It wasn't an absolution, but a release. Permission to heal. He carefully folded the letter and tucked it inside his shirt close to his heart. He looked at Sarah, his stormy blue eyes clear and bright. The ghosts were finally quiet. They returned to the ranch, not as people in hiding, but as partners ready to build a future. The burned-out barn was no longer a symbol of loss, but a space cleared for something new. Their love, forged in the fires of danger and tempered by the truths of a shared past, was stronger than any stone or timber. They would rebuild together,